Hello there. So good morning to you, good afternoon to you, and good evening to you. From wherever you are watching from, it is Mayegun Live, and we are starting this broadcast, not like our usual ones, okay? Where we started with music and all that. This is a recitation where we have started reading the book, A Fatherless People. So if you have any time joining us on this morning, afternoon or evening, thank you. So yes, share the broadcast. Do the audio check with me as well, because the audio sounds perfect to me. And if it does to you, this is us starting the book, A Fatherless People, the one we read the intro on yesterday, for those who were part of that yesterday afternoon. So we're meant to continue, or should we say, to start this afternoon. So if you by any chance watching me, this is the history of Nigeria, before Nigeria, the people. And this book is currently being read because, because of the recommendation made by the members of this platform to continue to dig deep into that past and further help our people who are mostly battling with identity crisis, where nobody can actually say he or she is a Nigerian except what they told us that we are. And in this instance, right, you will know that none in Nigeria who is a member of the endangered people or endangered group, I will tell you that any of them were part of the creation of this contraption, so to say. So yes, we won't be having too much of music and all that, except during the break. So if you have other things doing, I advise you to listen to these like you do not really have to sit down and watch, okay? You can put it aside and just listen, all right? So I also have our friends on TikTok joining us. Again, this is a reading session and it's going to last for hours. So if you're up for it, then plug in after sharing the broadcast, inviting your friends, inviting your not so friendly friends, telling them that Mayegun today. Hmm? So let's start. So we are now on chapter 1, which is slavery's end and colonization's beginning. In quote, Sir Thomas Fowell Buxton said, "I entirely disclaim any disposition to erect a new empire in Africa, remembering what has now been disclosed of the affliction of that quarter of the people and of the horrors and abominations which every spot exhibits and every hour produces." So abolition of slavery in America, just kind of historically. So it is often said that the slave trade came to an end because industrialization made it unprofitable. But as at the middle of the 18th century, when the Industrial Revolution is commonly said to have begun, abolition of the trade was far from the minds of the main players. In fact, measures were still being introduced to enhance it. In 1750, the slave trade was made even easier for British merchants. An act made the commerce entirely open so that it was henceforth lawful for all His Majesty's subjects to trade and traffic to and from any part of Africa. British merchants were not, of course, alone in the trade. It was the enterprise of the times for most of Western Europe and the Arab world. In Europe, the focus was on the liberation of the trade rather than the liberation of the traded. In 1753, the Spanish crown gave permission to Spanish companies to bring slaves directly from Africa to Cuba. The papal rule limiting trade with Africa to Portugal was at last unceremoniously put aside. France, for its part, having been compelled to surrender Canada and India to Britain as the price of defeat in the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763, was unabashed in recognizing the importance of the trade for its future. The French Prime Minister, Choiseul rather, sought immediately to develop new French interest in Africa so as to free its colonies in the West Indies from reliance on Britain, formally or informally, for the supply of slaves. That the provision of slaves was an essential part of French commercial policy, it was left in no doubt. Thus, in 1762, the Chamber of Commerce of Nantes declared the African trade is precious, not only because of gold and ivory. It is infinitely more so because of the blacks, that it makes possible because only they are capable of carrying through the hard work which the agriculture and manufacturing of sugar demand. Far from industrialization being the cause of abolition, it was the super profit made possible by the trade which stimulated and sustained the Industrial Revolution. And it was Britain's position as the dominant player in the trade that produced the situation where the Industrial Revolution began in Britain. A British historian, Neil Ferguson, acknowledges the traditional economic explanation as unconvincing. According to Ferguson, it is not easy to explain so profound a change in the ethics of a people. It used to be argued that slavery was abolished simply because it had ceased to be profitable. But all the evidence points the other way. In fact, it was abolished despite the fact that it was still profitable. Even so, Ferguson was so advanced an equally questionable theory of his own for this collective change of hearts. His argument that it was a moral revolution that mobilized not only legislators to ban the trade, but the Royal Navy to enforce the ban, still leaves the question as to what triggered this moral turnaround. The trade was, after all, a reflection of the prevailing morals of the times, which explains why other European powers expressed so much skepticism over the British claim to have undergone a moral conversion. The efforts of Great Britain to put an end to it, the slave trade, are not attributed to good motives, but to commercial jealous, I take that again, but to commercial jealousy and a desire to keep the monopoly of colonial produce in our hands. The grant of 20 million may have done something to quench these narrow jealousies, but still, the nations of the continent were slow to believe that we are entirely disinterested. The German states, which because it was still in formation, had no hand in the slave trade, could claim some objectivity in his questioning of British claims to have moved to a higher moral plan or plane than other Europeans, while the Germans are tormenting themselves with philosophical problems the English, with their great practical understanding, laugh at us and win the world. Everybody knows their declamations against the slave trade, and while they have paid off on us all sort of humane Marxism as the foundation of their proceedings, it is all last discovered that their true motive is a practical object, which the English always notoriously require in order to act, and which should have been known before. That's from a German state. What the evidence point to is that the practical object, which was the trigger for the abolition of the slave trade and later slavery itself, was the loss by Britain of its American colonies in the American War of Independence of 1776. Negroes inspired by the spirit of martyrdom. When it started, the American War of Independence was purely domestic affair between the British and the American colonies. However, in the French, the Dutch, and the Spaniards, perfidious Albion, as England was often referred to, had no shortage of neighbors with recent grievances to avenge. By the end of the war, in 1783, each of these fellow European powers had joined the fight on the side of the American rebels. The shared objective was to prise Britain's first empire from her grip. A point which seems little appreciated is that the African slaves in America had, through their combat role in this war, secured their own salvation. At the outset, the conflict was a matter of indifference of these slaves. The twist of fate came as both sides, the British and the rebels in turn, looked to the slaves for help in their war efforts. It was the British side who first felt compelled to do so. All slaves who were prepared to run the risks of escaping from their masters to fight on the British side were promised liberation after the war. The devil's bargain was set out in a proclamation made on 7th November 1775 by the British Governor General of the Colony of Virginia. He declared, "I do require every person capable of bearing arms to resort to His Majesty's standard or be looked upon as traitors to His Majesty's crown and government, and therefore be liable to the penalty the law inflicts upon such offenses, such as forfeiture of life, confiscation of lands. And I do hereby further declare all indented servants, Negroes, or others appertaining to rebels, free that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be for the more speedily reducing this colony to a proper sense of their duty to His Majesty's crown and dignity." That was the Governor General of Virginia, and declaring then, with this pledge, the British side now had the most eager recruits that the history of warfare may possibly have ever known. Africans had been held in bondage and transported in their millions to lay the foundations of America because of their natural physical strength. Their long period of subjugation had been made possible and sustained only by careful efforts to deny them access to and training in the use of guns. But this proclamation, by this proclamation, Britain changed the rules of the game, and the writing was on the wall for the end of slavery in America. However, neither Britain nor America was ready for a multicultural society at this time, one in which with blacks lived in freedom alongside whites. As it concerned the slaves, the words in the American Declaration of Independence were just fine words. In quotes, we hold this truth to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of quote. An overnight transition from a way of life in which the one had been subjugated by the other was viewed with understandable concern. For who knew when the spirit of vengeance might rise amongst former slaves, now trained in the use of guns and explosives, especially now that their numbers were significant. In 1790, there had been less than 60,000 free Negroes in United States. By 1820, there were 250,000. As part of the planning for the new independent America, which they desired, the leaders of thought in America had already begun to address their minds to the question of the role and place of the imported Africans within American society. The question was a racial one: whether free blacks were to be allowed to live as equal citizens alongside whites, and if the answer was no, what was to become of them? Writing in 1781, Thomas Jefferson, who authored the words in the Declaration of Independence, did not shy away from recognizing the unique problems that abolition of African slave trade posed. In quotes, Jefferson said, among the Romans, emancipation required but one effort: the slave, when made free, might mix with, without staining the blood of his master. But with us, a second step is necessary, unknown to history. When freed, is to be removed beyond the reach of the mixture. Samuel Hopkins, a clergyman from Connecticut, who had himself owned slaves in the past, was one of these early thinkers on the subject. His solution was what the European powers then adopted as blueprint for colonization of Africa. In early April 1773, congressional clergyman Samuel Hopkins of Rhode Island, the chief exponent of the still noble doctrine of benevolence, called upon the Reverend Dr. Ezra Stiles, later president of Yale College, and unfolded his plan for training 2 missionaries for Africa. Hopkins was eager to test his theological concept of dynamic evangelical Calvinism that would carry Christianity to the unredeemed throughout the world. The dark continent offered vast numbers of pagans and infidels, and Stiles suggested that they enlarge the project, organize a society, and send 30 or 40 well-structured Negroes inspired with the spirit of martyrdom. In this way, whites could compensate for injury and injustice of the slave trade, that unhallowed commerce of traffic in the souls of men. Of course, this plan of removal marked the start of the colonization program for Africa. Being the first of the original 13 colonies to declare its independence, Hopkins, Rhode Island State in New England already had the reputation as the pace-setting state then. By 1774, the state had passed a law forbidding importance. Hang on. I want to quickly check with all of us who are probably plugged in right now, just to be sure that the audio is still perfect. Yes. Let me know if the audio is pretty much still perfect on your own screen there on your device. so that you don't just sit there and be like, oh, I could barely hear what he's saying. Right. Okay, give me a sec. Hang on, no. There is okay, there is one off. Good enough that I checked, right? I actually have one of the microphone pretty much off, and in that regard, I ended up having to, you know, having not a sharp or loud or clearer tone, right? So it should be much better now as well. Okay, especially if you are watching on Facebook or YouTube or on Twitter, or everyone watching on TikTok or listening on TikTok. I don't think we have any problem, right? I don't think so. So yeah, let's hope that's it. The audio is perfect. Now let's continue. Sorry about that. Okay. So this plan of removal marked the start of the colonization program for Africa. Being the first of the original 13 colonies to declare its independence, Hopkins, Rhode Island State in New England already had the reputation as the pace-setting state. By 1774, the state had passed a law forbidding the importation of slaves. In 1784, the year after the War of Independence was won, the state followed up with a law which granted freedom to all slaves born within its boundaries after March 1785. In this way, New England in the United States of America could lay fair claim to having beaten old England to credit for leading the way in the abolition of slavery. Hopkins had set up a school to teach emancipated slaves theology in preparation for missionary work in Africa. It was Hopkins' formula that the British were to copy and implement in Sierra Leone in the coming years. Abolition in Europe. The loss of America had immediately and major consequences, the loss of America had immediate and major consequences in Britain, not least in the appointment in December 1783 of a new prime minister in William Pitt the Younger. Pitt was a pragmatist who saw things clearly. He knew that it was on the back of the slaves that so much development within a short period of time had been made possible for all the major powers. The slaves were the raw materials on which all enterprise depended. Slave labor being cheap and plentiful, all that was needed was suitable land on which to deploy them. So long as the expanse of America belonged to Britain, the country's status as the major player in the game was assured. With the loss of America, it now faced the prospect of relegation as against the other players. France, Netherlands, and Spain together with the newly independent United States. This was a script that could not be allowed to play out. The game had to be stopped. The strategy was dual-pronged. The medium-term element was to look for a way to forcibly take back the lost colonies by renewing the war. This came in the War of 1812. The immediate and subtler strategy was born of the knowledge that the newly independent United States was banking upon the continued supply of cheap slave labor, for its viability and development. Shutting off the supply of slaves by abolition of the slave trade would make the medium-term goal of retaking the rebel colony easier. But what to do with the slaves who would then be emancipated? The ink on the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which brought the long and bloody American War of Independence to a formal end, had barely dried before the former warring parties were acknowledging their common interest by exchanging ideas on what to do with the slaves who had been freed in the course of the war. By 1784, Britain's William Thornton was visiting Samuel Hopkins, and by 1786, he had moved permanently to Philadelphia to study more closely the American scheme for missionary-led colonies to Africa. The first challenge for Pitt was to sell the case for abolition to the British people. On the one hand, there were the British merchants and West Indian plantation owners who were now addicted to the super profit which this trade generated. And then there were the ordinary citizens. Different persuasions were required for the different constituencies. For the slave traders and plantation owners, only monetary compensation for loss of profits and amenities would do. For the citizenry, a new moral narrative was what was needed. However, there were a few amongst the informed public who had long felt appalled by slavery and the slave trade. The Quakers, for one, had long been of this view, and there were individuals like Granville Sharp, who had been calling upon the judges in various test cases to outlaw the evil without success. Now, with the major change in policy signaled from the very top, what had been a fringe movement against the trade in slaves and slavery very quickly became the subject of election pledges. The Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade was formed in 1787 with William Wilberforce as its founding secretary. Its assigned mission was to gather the evidence of the scale and evil of the trade in all its sordid detail in support of the campaign. Spelling the new moral code in a parliament whose members had all the while been using their collective intellect to pass laws to facilitate and encourage the trade, right down to the size and dimensions of the slave ships, was an especially difficult challenge. The members of the parliament for Liverpool, a small port town which had grown into a great city on the back of the trade, were especially keen to remind their fellow honorable members who were now in the abolition camp of their past complicity in the trade. This from the Liverpool slave traders. It's a different act of parliament which I shall not detain the House with moving to have read. Have encouraged the African slave trade. The preamble of one which runs thus: whereas the trade to Africa is highly beneficial to the acclaim of the pro-abolitionists, led by the Solicitor General, were not to be outdone. In their defense, they wrote, "I can well understand that nations as well as individuals may be guilty of the most immoral acts from their not having the courage to inquire into all the circumstances of this trade. But in that year, 1796, this House had the courage to appoint a committee to investigate the complaints which were preferred against it. The committee sat, and after a painful, anxious investigation, they reported to this House a great body of evidence by which it is established, beyond the possibility of dispute, that the African slave trade is carried on by rapine, robbery and murder, by encouraging and fomenting wars, by false accusations and imaginary crimes. Thus are these unhappy beings, in order to supply this traffic in human blood, torn from their families, relatives, and homes, not only in war, but profound peace, and after being sold in their native land, they are carried across the Atlantic in the most deplorable state in which it is possible to convey them alive, and under circumstances of too much horror to bear reflection." These were the arguments in the parliament of Britain at the time, the abolitionists. So, in a war between brothers, few home secrets survive. On 25th of March, 1807, an act for the abolition of the slave trade was passed by the United Kingdom Parliament. It declared the slave trade illegal in any part of the British Empire. Slavery itself, as distinct from the trade in slaves, remained legal. The British government, having taken the lead in Europe, now took on the task of persuading its fellow European powers to follow its lead. The defeat of Napoleon in May 1814 by a six-power European alliance led by Britain provided a perfect opportunity. While the primary objective of the new Treaty of Paris, which ended the war, was to redraw the map of the European mainland to contain future French ambitions, the British took the opportunity to insert a clause committing the restored Bourbon monarchy to the abolition of the French slave trade over a period of 5 years. The Congress of Vienna between the same great powers, which held from September 1814 to June 1815 to agree the new balance of power arrangement for Europe.